So the next topic is the administrative record. And I'm sure you all consider this to be an extremely stimulating topic, full of violence and sex and all sorts of stuff. This is the image of the past, and this is the image of the future in terms of where records go. So basic principles. Under CEQA, cases are resolved on the written administrative record. And people ask me all the time about, boy, am I going to be put on the stand about this in litigation? What do I say? Am I going to be deposed? And I'm always happy to say, no, you're not. It's all pieces of paper. When you get to court, there's no live witnesses. There's no new evidence. It's all just what's in the record. So the name of the game in getting ready to defend a CEQA approval is to make sure you have a really good record. So there's an anomaly in the law, or at least it seems an anomaly, and that is that even though the agency has the record, when someone sues the agency, they have the right to elect to prepare the administrative record themselves. And this goes back maybe 25 years or so, and the idea was that this would be a cost savings thing for the petitioners. And the legislature didn't really think about the logistical challenges of someone on the outside being responsible for getting all the documents from the inside into an organized record. And what's happened over the years is there's a pretty standard approach that most of the petitioners' counsel take, and that is they almost always elect to prepare the record unless they're just so flush with cash they don't really care about the cost. And then immediately, or before that, they do a Public Records Act request saying, give me everything in the record. And the reason they do that is that under the California Public Records Act, agencies can only recover their actual copying costs, like to use an ancient image, putting quarters into a copying machine. They can't get staff. So even though it might take hours and hours and hours of highly paid staff time to respond to a Public Records Act request, that's all on the house. So the petitioners will demand the record under the Public Records Act and get it virtually for free. Except for the cost of copying. Then they turn around and do an index and hand it back to you. And then the agency is responsible for certifying that. That's all supposed to happen in about 60 days. It almost never happens that quickly. Particularly in big cases with big records. Sometimes the record preparation process goes on for the better part of a year, which is litigation. So there's a very broad definition of the record. In CEQA, it's found in Public Resources Code, section 21167.6, subdivision E, parts 1 through 10. And it's very, very inclusive. And even though it's very, very inclusive, it's not necessarily all-inclusive, because the way the statute's written, it says the record includes the following, and the word includes means it may not be everything. It's suggesting that the respondents can go beyond the minimum things on the list if they wanted to. Apparently all-inclusive list. One thing that some people don't think about as they write emails that they really wouldn't want to see in a courtroom easel is that internal agency communications are part of the record. That language goes back to the early 1990s when email was sort of a space-age thing that maybe a few computer geeks were using, but not the average person. So when the legislature included that language, they didn't have emails in mind. Here we are 20-odd years later, and now a typical issue in administrative records operations. What do you do with the bajillion emails on people's servers? Do you really have to print them all? Do you need the lawyers to sort through them all for privilege? It can be a really onerous thing, but that's something we have to contend with because of that reference to internal agency communications. There have been some recent cases that have expanded the list even further. Yeah.
So agency communication is included. How about consultant communication? Is that included as part of the record?
Good question. Anything in the agency's inbox or outbox.
Gotcha.
Now, if you are just consultants, talking shit about your clients within the confines of your own agency or own consulting firm, possibly that stuff gets in the record. There is a case, so be careful.
Don't ever write anything down you don't want to see. You don't have to record.
The recent cases have said that where under a contract provision the lead agency has with its general contractor, if there's
boilerplate language saying that the lead agency owns your work product, suppose they fire you. They want all the stuff you produce. They own that. There's a court case that says that stuff's all part of the record. I don't know whether people are actually in the habit of doing that, but you're supposed to be doing it. That happened about 3 years ago. I don't know that it's routinely done. I think one reaction to it might be to revisit some of those boilerplate provisions. But in theory, something that never makes it in the inbox, if it's relevant, could be part of the record. So then there's another case that said that if someone writes you a letter and says, here's a URL where there's some really interesting stuff, and they don't give you a physical copy, you have to go print it out. If they just say, oh, there's something on the web, look for it. Just Google this. You don't have to do that. But if they give you a specific website, you've got to print that out and put it in your record. Also, if they say, oh, 6 months ago we gave you a document, we're not going to give it to you again, that's good enough to get it in the record. And if they say, we know you have in your file somewhere else for another project a copy, say, of a general plan, and we're citing it, then that becomes part of the record too. So there's got to be some legwork that the agency does when they get a letter like that. I was surprised by that outcome. I always had thought people need to give you the actual document they want to have in the record. They don't have to give you a URL or refer to documents that they think you've already got.
So it says there, if somebody volunteers in a comment letter to give you something, I've seen several where they say, if you want, we can provide yada, 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 and they list off a bunch of stuff. You're then obligated to track them down and get them to give it to you?
Yeah.
Wow.
So Jim, what if somebody in a comment letter says that, we know that you're preparing the 2016 general plan, we commented on the 28 general plan, or you're saying jurisdiction, and we hereby incorporate all of our comments on the 28 general plan by reference, and restate them as if they are comments on the 2016 general plan.
Well, there's two questions there. One is that stuff in the record? And probably if it's in your files and you can find that stuff, it's probably in the record. Second question, or implied question, is do you have to respond in writing to those as though they are comments? And I think the answer to that is no. But if they can make you go get the documents, put it in the file drawer, and you can do some litigation. But I don't think they can go back and make those comments by referring to them. I think they would need to make the comments again if they want to be letter.
So you would respond by saying those were comments on a different project and not this one, and therefore they're not relevant.
That's what I would do, yeah. Is there another question? Yeah.
Are digital PDFs equivalent to paper files? If you're storing everything on the computer?
Yeah. And I think we're moving in that direction. I'm going to talk about specific statutory provisions applicable just to so-called environmental leadership projects where there's a special approach to record preparation. And I've included that, or Margaret included it, I should say, Margaret Sahagi included these slides, because there's a bill in the legislature right now, SB 122, that would expand the scope of projects where that could be mimicked. It would be at the applicant's option. If the applicant wanted to opt in and pay for the staff time to have the record prepared as you go along, that would be something that would be coming down the pipe if that gets turned into law. So just be aware that you can be made to do some legwork by commenters who say, go print this out, go find that in your file drawer. And again, I'm not sure whether people are these habits. These court cases come out, and being creatures of habit, you guys say, okay, we can start doing that, and we just don't do it. But really, we should be doing those things. So this is some of the same points I just made. I'm not sure what that poor little animal is looking longingly about it. The birds have had to get over it. This is just your typical neighborhood group, I guess, in San Francisco. So there's one case I think is bizarre. It says that audio tapes are part of the record. And so you got an audio tape that's not transcribed, throw it in the record. The reason I think it's odd is in writing briefs, I don't know how to cite that. If you cite a document, you cite the page number. So the court can go look at the page. If you cite an audio disc, I guess you could try to figure out how many minutes in. And it's like hold fast forward 4 seconds with the thumb off. Look for a male or listen for a male voice. maybe it's an invitation to transcribe everything. But then again, there's limitations on what has to be transcribed. So this was just one court that basically took a broad reading of what a written document is and treated an audio tape as a written document. So in theory, our records should be full of all sorts of, if not cassette tapes, showing my age, discs with audio recordings of it. There was a case years ago called Protect Our Water, one of the injustices under CEQA, where an agency lost in court because the petitioner elected to prepare the record, and the record was so abysmally organized the court couldn't find key documents, and said, well, I can't even find the right findings, therefore I don't know if they exist, therefore you lose. And of course the respondent said, well, that's the petitioner's fault. They prepared the record, they're the ones that screwed up, why should they profit from their bad organization? And basically the court said it's your job and you certify it to impose an order on it. So hopefully that problem's gone away, because there's now a rule of court that tells you how to organize a record, and it's mandatory. And I bring it up in a setting like this, even though you folks aren't attorneys, because to help the attorneys, it's probably useful to start thinking of the organizational structure required under this rule, so that when you do get sued, you're halfway home. So basically, the decision documents are up front. Findings, resolutions, project approval documents, then the EIR, if there's an EIR, the secret documents, and then there's staff reports, and then when you get to everything else, it starts in chronological order. So you get all the good stuff up front that probably is most of what the parties are citing in briefs, and then once you're outside these specific categories, it's just, on day one, you start and you go to chronological order, the whole thing. And there's a requirement for very detailed indexes. In the index, it's supposed to say the title of each document and the substance. So if you have 100,000 emails, in theory, an index ought to say what's in each email. So this could be a real ordeal if you have a big record. Yeah. Like a fair and clear draft? Probably, unless there's a privilege to attach to it. And the slides will get into the various privileges, but I don't know that there is one to cover that. Anyway, so this rule of court basically says there's going to be tabs to make it easy for the judge and the parties to see where logical breaks are in the presentation. Got to be an index, as I mentioned. Electronic records are an option, and this has been the case for several years. So you just imagine you got these elderly judges who probably don't know how to turn on a computer, and they don't really want the administrative records in electronic form. Then you have some younger judges, and even a few older judges, who are, computer literate, and they like the digital records. So right now the rule makes it optional. And I think basically judges will tell you early in a case, do they want digital or do they want paper? A lot of them want both. So the rules make it optional to do digital. I think there's a trend towards digital. And so there's rules on how to do it. One good thing is they're supposed to be searchable. So it's an advantage if you're a lawyer with a big record to have searchable documents. You can say, where did the word cumulative impacts come up? And you find it everywhere. There's the record. So this is the way of the future. And I think more courts are moving towards this. They're getting a little less scared of the technology. And obviously there's a potential for big monetary savings just for saving the cost of printing literally tens of thousands of pages of paper. This is just a contemplative planner. So one issue is if there's a project with a long history, even if it involved litigation, you go back to the beginning of time. There's a few cases that deal with this where project starts out big, gets approved, goes to court, court finds a problem with it, project comes back in a smaller incarnation, finally gets approved. The record starts with the first version. And that's thought to be to the advantage of the respondent. And the court cases even say that petitioners have an incentive to have a small record so they can argue how little there is in it, And the respondents have an incentive and a desire for big records, so they can say how much is in it, and how long it has taken, and how much money it has taken to get to the finish line. Don't you feel sorry for me, Judge? I've been in purgatory for 100 years. Cut me some slack. And in fact, that is my favorite story to tell. You go from an applicant who's outraged that his project's been cut in half by the city council, and then immediately when you're in court, you're bragging about how CEQA worked and it mitigated impacts, and we listened to the public, and here we are with a much better project. Don't make us go back again. So this second quote here is just a sort of jocular statement a court made that's commenting on how all-inclusive the record categories are. Anything that never came near a project is part of the record. So this creates a problem because these records are very expensive. So one thing that happens a lot is that the courts will ask for the lawyers just to prepare compendia of the documents actually cited in the briefs. So you might have a record that's this big or 10 times this big, and then parties end up citing only these many documents, and that's what judges want to read. And so there's this huge waste of preparing this giant record, and then you only use part of it. So the parties are free to stipulate to a reduced record, but there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. If you're defending and you want to have a reduced record, you say to the petitioner, well, we can omit all the biological material if you promise you won't make a biological argument. And they'll say, well, I don't know yet whether I want to make a biological argument because I've got to read the record. To which you then say, well, then we can't cut that stuff out because if you want to make a biological argument, I need the biological stuff in the record. So in theory, the lawyers ought to be able to agree to a small record, but it's hard to do because people have to sort of abandon arguments early in the case in order to justify that, and they just don't want to do that. It speaks for itself. I don't know what it says, but it speaks for itself. So, in the dark days of recession, this is what passed for CEQA reform. We'll cut people a little bit of a break on projects that are just totally politically correct and are giant job-producing projects. There's something called environmental leadership projects. They have to be pretty green and pretty big, and you got to go to the governor's office to get a stamp of approval. And then if you get them, or get that stamp of approval, then you have a special process, which I referred to a little bit earlier. Essentially, it's the record being prepared, if not in real time, within 5 days of real time. So document comes into the agency related to the project, documents on the website of the city in 5 days. Document goes out of the city, it appears on the website 5 days later. And the idea is that the public can see this happening, this unfolding during the process. And it's all intended so that the record will be done essentially at the time of project approval. And so why would someone want to opt into this? Well, it would be a situation where the applicant's virtually certain of being sued and is willing to incur these costs in order to get the litigation going immediately. So right now, a typical time frame for litigation would be projects approved on December 1st, lawsuits filed on, a pretty good example is holiday, January 1st, January 2nd, Friday before that. And then 6 months later, the record's ready. And then the briefing happens in the next 6 months. Then you get it finally on the judge's calendar 6 months after that, and you spend 1.5 years, 2 years in trial court. And then there's an appeal, and that takes a long time. Under this approach, the record would be ready on day one, and you'd be writing briefs very quickly in the case, and then you'd get out of trial court really fast. So that's the theory. This is kind of the thing that maybe the environmental groups and the unions and the businesses can all agree on, because no one's giving up anything other than time. And even though a lot of the project opponents deep down like delay, they never admit it. So if you're in a conversation with them, they will not say, well, God, we want to delay. Even though that's what they often do. They say, oh, yeah, we'll agree to it as long as we don't have to give up anything, as long as we don't have to pay for any of this stuff. So part of this is, if the applicant opts for this, they're paying for the record, win or lose. Question?
So you're talking about typical timeframes. Can you talk about typical costs?
Costs for this real-time? I don't really know. As far as I know, there's only one project that's qualified for this, maybe a couple. And the records are a function of the size of the project. These are, by definition, these environmental leadership projects are $100 million or more. So presumably those are big records. So I think the cost would be quite substantial. You could have more staff, people putting this stuff on the website as it occurs. There's also optional mediation provisions and things like that built into the statute. So you'd have to have a big bank account for a very big project and have done the analysis to decide that all these upfront costs are worth paying because of the time saving on the litigation process. So it's probably not going to be done for, even if SB 122 gets enacted, it's only going to be done for big projects where litigation is virtual certainty, because why would you pay all this money up front if you didn't think you're going to get sued? But it does seem to be where the legislature may be going this year. So I talked about this, something comes in, it gets digitized, gets put on the website. And, the record's supposed to become public as it gets prepared, and I guess libraries are supposed to be copies as well. So then there's a question of what do you not include. And this is really a discussion of various privileges and also interpretation of statutory language. I think there's a view that if something is not a public record, could not be disclosed under the Public Records Act for various reasons, then it probably should not be in a CEQA, administrative record. The second bullet refers to consultant and sub-consultant documents. I mentioned earlier, if you have the standard boilerplate in the contract between the lead agency and a general contractor, it says the agency constructively owns your work product, and that stuff is part of the record. But that doesn't apply to the subs. So if Ascent is a sub to ICF, for example, ICF's files might go into the record, but not Ascent's. So there's a certain advantage to being a sub in that scenario, because you have more privacy. Again, I'm not sure everybody's in the habit of putting all these consultant documents in the record. Should. Yeah.
Would that be true even if the contract specifies flow down of all of the contract provisions to the sub?
That's a issue that hasn't been litigated, so possibly.
That's a contract issue though. So, if your contract says you have to have all documents in the and that's between you and your contract holder. I think that's different from the question being asked here.
Except it's based on the contract between the lead agency and us all the time.
Yeah, so this court case I talked about basically said that there might be documents that never made it to the lead agency. They were just in the bowels of the general contractor. And in theory, those documents are supposed to be part of the record. And the court in that case said this applied to the subs, but it didn't speak to the kind of fact situation you described. So I personally am not all that enthused with the court decision because it makes life more difficult. And plus, you had the audio recordings and all these websites you got to print out and walk down the hall and get all the documents from the other files. It's getting more and more onerous to prepare these records.
Do you have some nifty language that one can suggest go into a contract between a prime and a public agency that would avoid the situation?
I do not. Maybe I should, but I don't.
I want to ask something, when we're putting together a record, when we're preparing our environmental documents, whether you're a lead or you're a sub, there's certain things that you have to do, references, supporting your, everything with substantial evidence. And my guess is that, whatever this decision was, which is a head scratcher. I'm not sure why, if you're the prime, you need to produce everything, and if you're a sub, you're not. I just have to guess that it's just a matter of time before that is no longer, that exclusion is no longer provided. It just, in all cases, good behavior by all of us who are preparing environmental documents should be, we should expect at some point that we're going to have our work is going to end up in the public record. Whether they're decent or not.
I guess my concern was more about internal emails and records of meetings and things like that between the consultant team and whether those were part of the record. And whether there was a way around revealing those. I mean, it seems odd to me that it would extend to inter-team emails. But it does, so that's it.
I think right now we enjoy is that there's discretion on whether or not they're part of the record, but, you know, but one of the habits that we try to have, and this is very difficult to do, you all know that because you deal with emails all the time, is taking out that you know are part of the substantial evidence that you're using to build the information in your environmental document, and intentionally put those into the record. So, you know, after we grab those and say, okay, this is information that we need, it may be a dialogue between you and your subs, or somebody else, but grab those and put them in, because you want them as part of the record, but, yeah, the exclusion parts are, this is all about.
Anyway, moving right along, so we don't get too far behind here. I'm going to talk about these categories of exclusions based on privileges here. So we got the attorney-client privilege, we got deliberative process privilege, legislative process privilege, and third-party privacy. And there's several slides on this. There's also some hypotheticals, which I think we're not going to have time to do, but I invite you all to look at those on your own time. So attorney-client privilege does apply here. So, you know, there's communications from the city council, board, county council, and or city attorney and county council and their respective elected bodies or outside council. That's all privileged. And I'm very happy about that because it allows someone like me to be very candid with my clients in closed session. I've got land in Montana, and I'm involved in the planning process up there a few years ago. I learned that the county attorneys in counties in Missoula have no attorney-client privilege. So they have to give all their advice in public. So it doesn't allow them to be really candid because everything they say can then be rammed down their throat in another context. So I'm personally happy that that's not the case in California. Then there's this thing called the common interest doctrine, which is a general concept whereby if I'm an attorney and I have a client, and then there's another party that has an attorney, and another client has an attorney, and we're sort of moving towards the same goal, we can share our attorney-client privilege. We can you know, give our advice in the presence of the other party, and they'll have to maintain confidentiality. And so that's just a general principle. And over the years, there's been a question: does an applicant and a lead agency have such a common interest that would allow communications between the applicant and lead agency to be privileged? And basically the answer is no, based on this case, although arguably not in the third appellate district. So this is a case where, you know, kind of an extreme type situation led to a court recoiling. The facts here were that there was a proposed Walmart in the city of Ceres, and because Walmarts tend to draw litigation, right from the inception, the outside counsel for the city set up a deal where all communications between Walmart and the city had to go from Walmart's law firm to the city's law firm. So the record was utterly devoid of any kind of ongoing dialogue, you know, with the applicant. And the city attorney and the outside counsel just took the position that this common interest privilege applied. And the court rejected it, basically saying that there may be some common, maybe this is common here. There may be some aspects where the interests are aligned, but in other respects not. The applicant, of course, wants the project approved. The lead agency politically may want the project approved, or you might be able to get a sense that that's what the electeds want to do. But in theory, at least, the lead agency doesn't know what it's going to do, has an open mind, it wants a good process, wants to comply with the law, and then it's going to hear the project on its merits. And that's enough of a difference in interests that there is not a common interest between the two that would justify the approach taken in that case I described, where every communication between an applicant and the lead agency is privileged. So what that means, someone like me, is if I'm outside counsel, or I should say if I'm counsel for an applicant and I'm communicating with the city, anything I put in writing basically probably is public record. So I have to be careful about what I say because my opposing counsel might see it. It's a little frustrating because I'd like to opine at greater length than I'm able to in haiku-like communication to the speed riddles. But I think we'll need is more face-to-face meetings where you try not to leave such a trail. Now, there is a case out of the 3rd District Court of Appeal in Sacramento, which had gone the other way, although it's less clear what the facts are there. It's very clear from the facts in this case, this California Oak Foundation case, that once you're in litigation, there can be a common interest. In other words, if a project has been approved and the lead agency and the real party in interest together are defending against the opponents, then there's a common interest. They could share information during the litigation because you no longer are worrying about whether will the agency approve the project. They have done it. So that case clearly allows that. You can't tell from reading the case whether the sharing occurred before the litigation started. The Citizens for Series Court suggested that that was the case and said that we disagree with that. So they just starkly disagreed with the outcome here to the extent it did involve pre-litigation communications. So if you're in this part of the state, the 3rd District goes all the way from here to Oregon, not over the coast, but over to Nevada. You could argue that this case allows protecting those communications, but I think it'd be a hard sell to a lot of the counsel for the various agencies because of the strong language of the Citizens for Series case. So there's something called the deliberative process privilege. And I think the most well-known discussion of it came 8 or 10 years ago with respect to Dick Cheney's energy advisory group. You may remember that he had brought in a bunch of energy people, and among the things they decided was to exempt frac fluids from the Clean Drinking Water Act. And they didn't invite any environmental groups to their meetings. And then someone wanted to get information from that and decided to deliver the process. And so it is a legitimate doctrine. You see it developed in the context of case law under the Freedom of Information Act and Public Records Act of California. The notion is that high government officials need to be able to speak candidly within the bowels of government in order for business to be done. They've got to be able to let their hair down. They can't be on stage at all times. If everything they said and put in an email was discoverable or would end up in a record, then they'd be posturing even as they're sitting at their desk, like they're on TV. So if you want government to function, you create a zone of privacy for those folks. So it's reflected a little bit in the Public Records Act. There's a provision of the Public Records Act that says some documents can be withheld if the agency has concluded that on balance, the public interest is best served by withholding the documents compared to disgorging them, because if they were disgorged, there would be a chilling effect on candor within the agency. So it's unclear exactly how this applies to a secret record. This is this balancing test that I just mentioned. It's also unclear who the high government officials are. So if a planning director is writing emails, maybe he or she is a high government official. Is planner one, 1 year out of planning school, is that a high government official? Is that individual's email subject to the deliberative process privilege? We don't know. There's not much case law on it at all. All we know is there is a case saying it does apply in secret records, but it's not something that can just be asserted without explanation. If the agency wants to withhold documents, it has to explain why they're doing it and give some indication of the substance of it. It'll take the form probably of a privilege log. Then there's something called the legislative process privilege. This is usually discussed in court cases where the opponents want to depose politicians. So you're unhappy with the outcome of the Board of Supervisors hearing, and you want to just get this board member under oath and just ask them all kinds of questions like, you did that for the campaign contributions, didn't you? You're really a hack, aren't you? Maybe the courts invented this doctrine for ex-politicians, but you can never get at that. The theory is that if the outcome is rational, it will be upheld, and we don't care about the motives going into the decision. The mental processes of legislators, including local legislators, are protected. So that applies in general. It's not 100% clear the extent to which it would apply in a secret record. I've actually never seen in any of my cases a member of the Board of Supervisors write an email. It's crass. I don't know They just don't do it, or at least I'm not seeing it. Hypothetically, one of these hypotheticals Margaret's created, there is such an email, and she says it's protected by this privilege. So I mentioned that there's this first phase of Tricker Water where the petitioner's disorganization redounded to petitioner's benefit. I'm hoping that won't happen anymore because it's full court imposes organization, and it should be easy for courts to find the right documents now. So we talked about a case here where the record as prepared didn't include certain information, and it wasn't fatal to the process because the court decided that the missing stuff really didn't matter. It was stuff that was in favor of the project, or it was duplicative of other materials, and or not good at all. So it's not an absolute that if you accidentally omit things from the record that should have been in there, that you lose in court. It's going to depend on the importance of the documents, but obviously you don't want to intentionally leave stuff out. You want to err on the side of putting stuff in. So people are familiar with the late hit phenomenon. We have only included this information because there's a court case that sort of helps line that. The problem with late hits is that under CEQA, someone can exhaust their administrative remedies up into the final completion of the public hearing of the project. So you could be in a situation where no one commented on the draft EIR, no one showed up at the planning commission, the matter has to go to the city council, and then at the very end of the city council hearing, some horrible lawyer walks up with a 100-page single-space letter demanding you not approve the project and raising all sorts of legal issues. That is okay in most instances because the legislature has put so far towards the end of the process the deadline for exhausting administrative remedies. It drives agencies crazy, drives applicants crazy. There is one case that deals with the document dump where there's so much that they couldn't possibly digest it all, and then someone tries to sue you based on something buried in the middle of this huge pile of stuff. And that's his Creed case. So at the last second, the guy shows up, hands in a DVD, puts it in the record, and then walks up to the podium and says nothing about the singer in the middle of that DVD, and then sues on the singer in the DVD. I think what the court is basically saying is that's unfair, that's sandbagging. Now, if that person got up and said, on page 4,000, there's material that supports the following argument, your EIR is deficient for blah, 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 that would probably be sufficient. So this was a welcome antidote to what had been a very common process of just a wheelbarrow full of stuff dumped on the agency at the very last minute. Then there's this case here. It's not a model of clarity in terms of what it says, but it seems to say that where you have a project where the planning commission is the final decision maker because it's a non-legislative action, and there's a right of appeal to the higher body, but it's not automatic. Then when there is an appeal, the city or county can have rules for an orderly appeal, and they can say, get all your information in a week in advance to the city council or a supervisor's hearing. And if you're in that situation, you have to comply, and you can't do the last minute data. But that situation would only apply where there's a formal appeal, and that would mean for legislative actions like general plan amendments, rezone, specific plan approvals, because the planning commission's action is advisory and there's no need for an appeal, that you couldn't have that. So for a legislative action, you can't set these orderly rules like you could on an appeal, and you just have to put up with the last minute stuff. So, practice tips: start early, keep the rule of court in mind as you organize stuff. Be aware of the policies the agency has. Sometimes if there's a threat of litigation, something called a litigation hold you can put on, and former practices of deleting emails every 30 days, that sort of thing, might be halted, because once you're under threat, that could be considered a disruption of evidence. Err on the side of including stuff, and just make sure everybody within your agency knows all these rules and is cooperating with whatever effort you're trying to follow and make sure you're keeping things organized. Another thing that's good practice is because when you release a draft EIR or proposed negative declaration for public review, your notice has to say where those documents and all documents referenced in them can be found. You're going to have a big burden to put everything in your bibliography in the agency offices in case anyone asks for them. So in light of that requirement, that's even another reason to start early
And if you have everything ready at this early point of the process, that's a good jump on having the rest of the record ready shortly after the project's approved. So I think I'm going to leave the hypotheticals to you all and we'll have the next session proceed before lunch. Unless there's any questions. Yeah.
So, on attorney-client privilege, what about communications between the client's attorney and the client's consultants? Are those privileged? Does that protection extend?
The attorney-client privilege extends between the attorney and the client and the agents of the client who are necessary to effectuate the advice of the attorney. So if I'm a lawyer for an agency and Gary is the consultant, Gary's within that privilege because if I talk to the client directors and turn around and say, Gary, do it. So he's within the fold.
Okay.
Now, if I was representing an applicant, that wouldn't work. I mean, it would work to a consultant working solely for the applicant, but it wouldn't work for the agency's consultant.
Okay. And then this might be a little esoteric, but I've seen quite a few consultants doing this where they're emailing between each other and they CC the attorney and then claim attorney-client privilege on that, even though it wasn't directed
that's
at
wishful
them.
thinking.
Okay.
CCing a lawyer doesn't make you a lawyer.
Yeah.
Now, if there's legal issues involved, then maybe so. So I think it's a good practice to CC the lawyers when you're talking about something that has to do with legal issues, because that might be enough to protect it. But if the substance has nothing to do with legal issues, and you just, as a matter of habit, are copying the lawyers and just asserting confidentiality, that probably is not going to hold.
Thank you.
Two follow-up things. In that particular situation, if you're not sure, there's this really unique device that you use for having this issue. It's called a phone. Pick up the phone, talk to your city attorney or there's an attorney that has been retained for this, ask them about it, and then they'll give you the appropriate direction on how to handle that. As a practitioner would say, and I think, if you're going to do with this and anybody else who's preparing UARs for it, then you have to put together the script art, and you're preparing an EI copy, and we're doing a document for it as a public. There are, and I hope I don't pick on anybody here, but I'll just start out with cultural resource experts. Sometimes tend to cite everything under the sun as a reference material. And you end up with this reference list that sometimes is almost as big as the section itself that's addressing the issue. It's a good idea to talk to those people who are writing that material and say, honestly, is this really germane to the project, the impact analysis, or is this general fluff information? And there's everyone else not really necessary. Tell that this down, because realize you're going to have to generate it in the end of this litigation.
Also, if you cite copyrighted material, probably in order to put the records, you have to buy a copy of it. Somebody will copy it. So cite that stuff you do.
That's Jim's way of saying buy their book. They read it straight well.
They actually do.
It's fantastic. You guys are in the process of updating it, right?
Yeah, as we have to.
It's a passionate. Okay. Best book on SQL other than SQL. All right. Well, we're going to cruise into lunch. I'm not going to congest you with a bunch of new information. Talking about traffic. This presentation was prepared by Chris Calpe of OPR, Chris Ganson of OPR, and Ron Milan of Baron Peer. So that's relevant, in particular the two Chris's, because they are currently responsible for preparing new guidelines for transportation impact analyses. So before I start, how many people have heard about SB 743 in transportation? Not everybody, but most people. Okay. Well, a couple years back, Senate Bill 743 was passed, and it had the basic component for those of us in Sacramento was that it dealt with the Kings Arena. It had all kinds of CEQA exemptions, well, not really CEQA exemptions, but ways to speed through the litigation process dealing with the Kings Arena. It also dealt with this small thing called traffic impacts in CEQA. And before I get into exactly what we're gonna talk about in the presentation, I'm just gonna read to you from the legislation where this issue comes up. So, it's under section 5 of the legislation, under chapter 2.7, modernization of transportation analysis for transit-oriented infill projects. You get that whole title? For transit-oriented infill projects? It says that let's see, upon certification of guidelines by the Secretary of the Resources Agency pursuant to this section, automobile delay as described solely by level of service or similar measures of vehicular capacity or traffic congestion shall not be considered a significant impact on the environment pursuant to this division, except in locations specifically identified in the guidelines, if any. Okay? So, it's under the title Transit-Oriented Traffic Impact Analysis for Transit-Oriented Infill Projects. That sounds like that's CEQA-wide, doesn't it? It is. When the legislation was going through the process, the legislative intent talked about this being intended to deal with transit-oriented infill projects. But at the last minute, that part got pulled out. The intent that this deals with only transit-oriented infill projects. So now the legislative intent does not say that. Notwithstanding that this is in that that division of the legislation, OPR believes that this applies to CEQA in general. So we'll talk about what this really means. Okay. Level of service. So the other day I was driving on the freeway. It was a Saturday, and traffic was flowing really well. So it was great. And then on a Monday, I was on the same freeway, and traffic was congested. So on Monday, I was environmentally impacted on the same freeway, and not on Saturday. That's level of service. Level of service, which is something that we've been dealing with in CEQA for quite some time, deals with the free-flowing conditions of a roadway. And by the way, John Gard here is a fantastic traffic engineer. So I'm just going to look over at him as I say various things. He's gonna say, you know, no, you're wrong. Right, thumbs up, thumbs down. Because I'm not a traffic engineer. I just drive in traffic and experience it like everybody else. But let me ask a question here. If you've ever been in traffic congestion, have you personally felt like you were being environmentally impacted? No? Yeah, a couple people were environmentally impacted and some people aren't. I know I'm a little snarky about this, but this is one of those social issues that has been brought into CEQA. And it has unintended consequences. Ignores regional issues. Level of service is about how free-flowing a roadway is. And it doesn't necessarily deal with, when you're looking at one project, what can happen throughout the region with that project. So you may have a greenfield development project in a new community, and the new community may have roadways that were built out to handle all the traffic from that community, and an environmental impact report or a CEQA document and negative declaration may say there are no impacts associated with traffic from this subdivision within this community because the roads are big. And then those cars get on the road, they drive, they end up in downtown, Mainsville, USA, and they're coming from all these other greenfield developments, and ultimately the downtown's getting more and more and more congested. So LOS typically doesn't look at that. You can say, well, traffic analysis really can look at that, but they typically don't. So it's myopic, it's expensive to calculate and not very accurate. some of the words I've heard on LOS is that it can be off by, on a project that's approved now, that LOS is good to plus or minus what, 10%, John? He's not gonna say. As you get further and further away from the time that a project was approved, the LOS that you calculated at that intersection can be off by 30 to 50%. This stuff happens that you can't predict. Other projects are approved that you didn't think were gonna happen that way. People didn't drive the way that you thought that they were going to drive. Yet, we have been basing environmental impact analyses and significance determinations on the precision of level of service. It went up by 0.01% at that intersection 3 miles away. Therefore, we have to do an environmental impact report because we're now exceeding that threshold of significance. And to add a little silliness to it, I was working on a project, I'm not going to say where, but the project resulted in an extra 3 seconds of delay at this one intersection. And because it was very close to a threshold level, that extra 3 seconds, that extra 3 seconds of sitting in your car was deemed a significant impact, and an EIR was required for that. Worked for the city of Sacramento on the 65th Street Transit Village project several years ago. Great project. We've got rail coming into this area. The area was underdeveloped. The city wanted to put in a student housing complex, shopping, all sorts of things that are really appropriate for the urban fabric. And a lot of the reasons why this project was being promoted was to take advantage of rail transit. Well, it so happened that because it was by rail and in an urban area, the intersections were fairly congested. There was one significant impact in the entire project, and it was to level of service. So an environmental impact report had to be prepared on this infill project strictly because of this one issue. So LOS is myopic, can create more impacts. What is a solution for a level of service for congestion? If you're calling it a significant environmental impact and you have to mitigate that impact, what do? Build more capacity, right? Usually, widen the roadway. And when you widen the roadway, does that reduce traffic over time? I grew up in Orange County. Every time there was a new roadway built to solve a problem, within 6 months to a year, that roadway was congested. And then the road would get wider and wider and wider. So LOS has been myopic. It's resulted in a lot of problems, stifled infill development. It also penalizes other modes of traffic. It can adversely affect bicycle travel. If what we're doing is building roads just to satisfy automobiles, sometimes the only solution is to widen into lanes that would otherwise be used for other modes of traffic, pedestrian traffic. We widen roads and make it very difficult for people to get across those roads at intersections because they're wider and wider and wider, and with an aging population, we make it more and more difficult for people to just walk where they want to go. So there's a lot of problems with level of service. Senate Bill 743 was intended to align with state policy with SB 375 and a lot of the other state policies dealing with climate change that focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and what better way to do that is through a reduction in automobile use. However, we're replacing LOS with new criteria. So we're going to talk a little bit about where the state is going with this, and then I'd be interested in discussing some of the pros and cons and how we can better address the issue. One thing that's very important to know is that the new standards that the state is talking about removes congestion from CEQA. So there was a discussion draft of guidelines that came out several months ago, maybe a year ago, And the discussion draft of the secret guidelines removes level of service entirely and any congestion-related metrics for determining significance. There was a lot of concern expressed at that time that removal of level of service would affect local jurisdictions' police power, their ability to levy impact fees to deal with congestion. And OPR said, no, that's not the case. You still have your general plan, you still have the zoning authority. So all of those things that local jurisdictions deal with congestion can still be there. Your general plan can still have a goal for maintaining certain level of service standards. But whereas in the past, well, still the present, because this is not, these guidelines are not adopted, they were just draft proposed guidelines. But whereas under CEQA right now, we look at congestion as a significant impact. We look at increased delay as a significant impact. Under the new guidelines, if they go forward, that will no longer be considered a significant environmental effect. It'll just be looked at the same way we look at the size of a water line. Is a water line large enough to convey the amount of water that needs to go through a certain area? And if not, and you have to expand it, will there be environmental impacts from expanding that water line? Well, by the same token, if a city maintains level of service in their general plan as an infrastructure, as a congestion issue in the general plan, and in order for a project to move forward and be consistent with the general plan, more capacity needs to be built into the roads. The focus of CEQA will be on the environmental impacts of providing that extra capacity. Kind of like the impacts of widening the road, right? So that's where CEQA is going. The discussion draft guidelines are available on OPR's website. Their comment period, well, we'll get into that in a moment. The comment period is closed in the house. It was out for draft review for quite some time. OPR did a great job of reaching out to cities and counties. Anybody here meet with OPR during the process or go to one of their workshops or heard about them? They did try to meet with a lot of stakeholders on this issue to collect comments, and so now they've got them and they're figuring out exactly what to do. So right now, and the legislation focused on replacing congestion with a different metric. And the metric that is recommended in the legislation is vehicle miles traveled for a similar time threshold. So vehicle miles traveled replaces congestion as a significance threshold. And so the new guidelines, section 15064.3, the draft guidelines goes through, and I encourage everybody to look at it. It's only about 3 pages long, the new guidelines, and you can find them on OPR's website. There's a good chance that these guidelines, these draft guidelines, are going to be tweaked, but not dramatically. So 15064.3, this says old, but currently the effective project on LOS at localized intersections is the focus of EIRs. And what this would do is in a downtown area, on an infill project, it would point out where all the congestion is, right? So you have a lot of congestion, and instead of doing a negative declaration on a great infill project because you have congestion, you'd have to prepare an environmental impact report because you're exceeding a threshold. Oftentimes in these infill areas, in the urban core, with their older parts of cities, in order to widen a road, you have to knock down buildings. There's just not enough right of way. So these are some of the problems that we've been dealing with. So the argument has been that LOS has discouraged infill development because it requires a greater CEQA document than a greenfield project where there's plenty of roadway capacity, where it's really easy to do this. Traffic's not the issue any longer on a greenfield project. We can just do a negative declaration. It's more efficient as a developer. So changing that to vehicle miles traveled, and in looking at this model, here you show all these affected intersections. But if you go to a VMT model and you're in an urban core with an infill project, and you've got transit and that sort of thing around, your vehicle miles traveled would be comparatively less than developing something way out in the suburbs. So vehicle miles traveled becomes a surrogate now, becomes the focus of significance thresholds.
Excuse me. What is the LTS stand for?
Level of service.
No, LTS.
Lessons. Thank you. Okay. So under current standards, effective transit and active transportation projects on level of service, again, is the focus. Now, transit, active transportation that reduces VMT, it becomes more of the focus. We're looking now at things like safety of bicyclists and issues like that, rather than, so if a project would remove a bicycle lane, then it might have a significant impact versus under current standards, if it's just congested, if the roadway is congested, that would be a significant impact. So now we're looking at whether we're affecting bicycle safety, pedestrian safety. When you move a travel lane over into the sidewalk, or you reduce the size of the sidewalk, or expanding an intersection. These are things now that the guidelines are saying would be potentially significant effects. Interestingly, in the old days, which we're currently living under, if you're going to adversely affect a roadway, the solution is to widen it. Under the new guidelines, if you widen it and create more capacity that can reduce travel, that's a significant effect. It's the opposite. The opposite. The whole purpose, again, of these new guidelines is reduction of vehicle miles traveled. Safety. Companies I really like, by the way. You ever deal with a project that has a turn pocket or an off-ramp on the freeway, and during congested times, cars are going to back up from that on-ramp onto the freeway? You ever dealt with a project like that? Caltrans is, their reaction is, well, okay, that's not a CEQA issue. But the extra cars that slow you down on the freeway, that make it take another 5 minutes to travel, that's a significant environmental effect. This changes that. This says that if you're creating a queue that extends onto the freeway, that's a significant safety impact under CEQA, or maybe a significant safety impact under CEQA. This kind of, makes a lot of sense. Increased exposure of cyclists and pedestrians. So this issue that I talked about before, making it more difficult to ride your bike, or less safe to ride your bike or to walk. These are now considered significant transportation impacts. Speed differentials of 15 miles per hour between lanes is also considered a potentially safety significant impact. And John, I just don't quite understand what that one's all about. Maybe you do. Help us.
Yes, speed differentials are associated with higher observed and accident potential. So when you have speed differentials in that level, that's not as an issue about children as we significant impact to reduce accidents.
Okay. And we all can agree that a rear-end collision is an impact, right? All right.
Question.
Yeah.
Speed differential between lanes, multiple lanes going the same direction, or what are we talking about?
Yes. Turning lanes and through lanes. That's not how the guidelines read, which is,
Those are just example guidelines.
his colleague, he's blaming his colleague now. So, in terms of, so we're now going to vehicle miles traveled. And if you talk to OPR and you ask them, how did the review cycle go for the guidelines, they'll tell you that it was pretty challenging. They received hundreds of comments. And you say, okay, so where are you guys going now? You know, you've got, as the legislation says, traffic congestion shall not be considered a significant impact on the environment pursuant to this division, except in locations specifically identified in the guidelines, if any. So the question is, well, are there exceptions? Are you just going to do this, apply this to transit-oriented infill project, and the locations, if any, is everywhere else? And their answer is that we're not inclined to go there right now. So OPR is feeling, at least in discussions, they're feeling that it's time to get rid of LOS as a significance threshold and instead go to vehicle miles traveled. So what does that mean? The way that the guidelines are now written is a development project that is not exempt, so isn't categorically exempt from CEQA or statutory exempt, and that results in vehicle miles traveled greater than regional average for the land use type. The regional average for the land use type. Residential, employment, commercial may indicate a significant impact. So 50% are and 50% are, right? Average. If you're above the average, then these guidelines say that may be a significant impact. If you're below the average, then presumably, it doesn't say it's not, but presumably you would not have a significant impact. Region refers to the Metropolitan Planning Organization or Regional Transportation Planning Agency within which the project is located. Development projects that locate within 1/2 mile of either an existing major transit stop or a stop along an existing high-capacity, high-quality transit corridor, so that's defined as having a certain number of transit stops, generally may be considered to have a less than significant impact. Similarly, development projects that result in net decreases in vehicle miles traveled. So you put that, you have two Walmarts, you put another Walmart in the middle. Are you reducing vehicle? I don't know. Anyway, if you decrease VMT, then then you may consider that project to have a less than significant traffic impact. So this deference is rule of reason. Public agencies are allowed to determine what the best metric is to use as rule of reason. There may be other metrics that they want to come up with that would appropriately look at vehicle miles traveled. If we're in San Francisco and we're already in a very congested area and the average VMT is 4 miles of projects in that area, and we have one that's 5, would they say that's a significant impact? I think that they would argue that in a circumstance like that we already have very low VMT, we should encourage on a regional basis development within this urban core. Anyway, why do an EIR? Because you might happen to have have a slightly larger than average within this very dense area VMT. So there is a rule of reason that gets applied to this. You just have to justify it. You may use models to estimate VMT, so there are models out there, and may revise inputs, outputs to reflect professional judgment. Just explain your assumptions. So how many times have you worked on a project and it looks like it's the right kind of project, and then you pull out the manual, you're working with a fantastic traffic consulting firm like Aaron Peters or one of their competitors who may or may not be here. And they say, well, the ITE manual, the Institute for Traffic Engineers manual, says that this project is going to have a trip generation rate of 100 vehicles based on the size. But based on where it's located, I think that the trip generation is going to be a lot less. It's right next to residential areas. It's a shopping center right next to a residential area. People can walk there. So professional judgment can come in. You just have to explain your reasons. Appendix F is being expanded. We talked about Appendix F in the when we were talking about energy and the Woodland case. Appendix F is the appendix of CEQA that deals with wasteful energy, and it's proposed to be expanded to deal with examples of how you can reduce vehicle miles traveled. There's a lot of examples in there. They come out of well-established studies and things like that. They're like providing traffic calming, bicycle parking, limiting your parking supply, charging more for parking in certain areas. So lots of ways that you can reduce VMT and encourage transit in its place for other modes of traffic. That becomes, Appendix F will be expanded to include these examples. How will this apply? Right now, there's a proposed phased approach. So if you start your environmental document now, you don't necessarily have to. Right now, the guidelines are not available. So if you start your environmental document now, you still have to look at level of service or congestion or whatever you have done traditionally to evaluate traffic impacts. Once the guidelines are applied, you would have to use the new, so once guidelines are adopted, you would have to use the new VMT method for determining whether or not you have a significant impact and safety and other issues that are part of these guidelines. What OPR is proposing is that upon adoption, they'll apply immediately to transit priority areas, and that agencies have the discretion to opt in immediately, but that the guidelines would apply statewide after January 1st, 2016, which isn't a long way off. So that's the proposed time frame. Okay, next steps. Again, OPR closed the comment period November 21st, so they're now looking at comments. They will at some point. OPR will release proposed guidelines to the Natural Resources Agency, and then it goes through this formal process with the Office of Administrative Law, correct? Yeah, and comes out as new guidelines. I'm going to say I've worked on one project before in my career that dealt with new regulations and new guidelines. I see Deborah Lilly is here. She also worked on that. It was a very controversial project that dealt with new septic tank regulations throughout the state. There's so much public opposition to it, even though legislation mandated that new regulations were adopted. The state was under so much heat that they ended up essentially punting and not adopting new regulations. So, OPR says they'll be adopted. There's been a lot of controversy. We'll see if they ultimately are adopted. For now, level of service is still around. OPR is encouraging that we do vehicle miles traveled analysis in our environmental documents. So if you're preparing one, VMT is something that we should look at. We're generally already doing that now for greenhouse gas analyses, but not always. There are other ways to get to greenhouse gas impacts and air quality impacts. OPR is encouraging this. I'm not sure that it's got a legal mandate out there. Getting I understand that. So if you're preparing an environmental document and you want to look at VMT, go ahead and look at it. This is where I get a little bit lost on the VMT basis. Go ahead.
noise analysis, although I'm sure the noise analysis will be thrilled to finally get the EMT numbers that I can with. So we are looking at how this change will bring the trickle to them, or will that be part of the post-implementation?
Right, so the question is, maybe if I can put it into two different questions. One is, does this change affect the need to do air quality, noise, and other transportation-related impact analyses? And the answer is no. We still must do those. So we still must look at noise impacts, air quality impacts, anything that is an effect of more cars on the road. The companion question is, well, aren't those analyses based on where cars travel? So don't you have to do a traffic impact analysis that looks at roadway congestion and things like that anyway? I think that's a good question. I think the answer is probably yes. So I don't think this changes whether or not traffic impact analyses are done. I think it just adds another element to it. Any other?
Do you have any insight on how OPR is going to establish the regional EMT number and how to use the SAFOG area as an example where you've got jurisdictions who are very urban oriented and have low EMT population, and then you've got jurisdictions that are just the opposite, they're rural and you have high EMTs. So they're going to be weighted based on population to where the rural jurisdictions are discounted in any sort of way, or?
Right. So the question is, if you're in a rural area, you're looking at rural projects, and the average trips in your area, the average length of trips in your area happen to be long because you're in a rural area, maybe, versus an urban area. Right now, the way the guidelines are written is it's based on the average length of trips for the land use type within the metropolitan planning area or the transportation planning agency area. So if your area includes a wide area like Sacramento region, then if you're in a rural area, it's going to be more difficult to demonstrate that you don't have a significant impact to transportation under the way that the guidelines are written. Let me just, I'm not going to get into a lot of the technical details of how EMT are calculated because very few of those are traffic engineers. There are models available. First off, if you got a crack transportation engineer on your team, they will be able to tell you what the DMT is. They've got these really magic black boxes that they put everything into, and then it spits out results. And it's really easy, right, John? Please.
So, just looking at time for our characters, and to your point, certain education, there are EMT members of movement, you state about the projections of the EMT hospitals,
Right. Here's a map right here. The green areas are below average. VMT, yellow is average, red is above average.
So, there's a lot of ways to calculate VMT it's helping you get people to understand to figure out the amount of time, the distance, and the number of people leaving that trip. We just have visual comprehension because which take up the origin and destination of the trip. But what you'll realize is that if you see any VMT calculation, that's resolution. There are a lot of different ways of calculating. There are different inputs you can take. Is it involved right VMT or only VMT or maybe a middle block in the corner or something like that? So one of the things that's going to happen before this goes through the OPR state law and various entities, how do VMT calculations are going to factor a lot of things.
Great, thank you. By the way, one thing that I marvel at is, you know those like when you agree to, when you download an app on your phone and you have to agree to all the terms and conditions? And you've read those, right? He gets the data. Interesting stuff. Within this region, there are models. They're desktop models. They're as accurate as the generic data will provide. People, be a traffic engineer can run Cali mod. That's generally an air quality model. Urban footprint, Sketch 7, these are all models that are available in this region and in other regions to evaluate and determine what the EMT is. So there are things that are available without having to do a full traffic impact analysis just to determine the EMT. And then again, we've got this model in Sacramento. We have this map. And so if you're in one of these areas and you have a project that's not exempt, so it's a 20-unit subdivision and it's out here, then under these new thresholds, you would likely have to prepare an environmental impact report because you'd be above the significance based on traffic. If you're in this area, in this green area, and you've got a 1,000-unit subdivision, then traffic, EMT, would not be the reason why you'd have to prepare an environmental impact. Okay. If you're working on a project, expansion of a project, I do a lot of work for the Department of Corrections, and a lot of their projects are located in rural areas. So under this theory, if they're going to do a minor expansion of a new medical facility that's not exempt for whatever reason, doesn't hit any of the exemption criteria, add 20 employees, then probably it would be a significant impact under this criteria. So there are consequences. Of course, the rule of reason comes in. It's only 20 vehicles, it's only 10 vehicles, that sort of thing. So the rule of reason still applies. You can still cast the argument that it's not a significant impact, but you're fighting against the may have language, which is fair argument language. So keep that in mind.
A lot of infrastructure projects are construction phase and the last trucks and overall condition of the you can argue that EMTs over a 10-year time period are below average. Or do you think that there's an argument that during the micro construction method you might have whatever EMT for the truck
Right. So the question is, if you have a project whose only impact is during construction, really, because it's an infrastructure project, if you're building a pipeline, and there's a lot of construction traffic, but it's dispersed through the area, but otherwise it doesn't cause congestion. Well, we don't care about congestion anymore, so we're not worried about that. Would that be considered a significant impact if people have to drive great distances to this construction project? And that's the only real effect, is they're increasing vehicle miles traveled. You know, I'm not sure. It doesn't, construction's not really a land use type. I think that, the argument can go either way. I don't know. I don't know if anybody else has a thought on that. These are guidelines that are being proposed right now, so we don't really know whether they're going to
Let's get the questions. Practice that are similar to the one you similar. Is it a transmission tower or air tower taking down from that area versus out in, Colorado Hills, maybe there's less DOT just for that purpose. And what is the definition of what is, similar project?
Very clearly, and I'll take some more questions, but very clearly, the intent of the guidelines is not to say you can't develop in certain areas, but from a CEQA process standpoint, to encourage development in areas that are already close to urban development. And if you're not, then the penalty is preparing an EIR. Question?
Aside from the legislators, who are pro and con against this? Large agencies, small government, CSAC, who's...
There's a lot of, so who's pro and con for this? There are a lot of concerned agencies. I think the California League of Cities and I think CSAC have submitted a lot of comments expressing their concerns. Environmental agencies, on the other hand, or environmental groups, are very supportive of it. So You know, a lot of the concerns are around police power. And OPR has tried to address that by saying, we're not affecting whether you can have LOS standards in your general plan and whether we can collect transportation impact fees. That is not at stake here. What is at stake is the type of environmental document you need to prepare based on where you're located. So there's a long way of saying, I don't know.
Is there a way that you can look at this from a programmatic EIR standpoint? You know, maybe coupled with your general plan update. You look at BMP as a whole and make your declarations of significant unaffordable and then tier future projects off of that. Is as a practitioner, is any topic you would have an approach as of doing an EIR each and every time?
So David is asking the question that if you prepared a program EIR that already addresses the significance of this impact, and now you're looking at subsequent development that's consistent with the general plan, can you tier off the general plan? Yeah, the answer is sure. Yeah, you can tier off it, and you've already addressed the issue, and you're within the scope of the program EIR. Then I would say that you're fine to go. You just document that in an initial study checklist. There are some agencies I know that are looking at this and trying to take what OPR is doing and kind of customize it to your situation. So, for example, they're updating your circulation elements and the policy provisions, and then preparing the EIR to address these issues. So that's how I'm seeing this start to play out in the state.
Going back to the next question on the infrastructure type projects. If you're dealing with like a lot of hauling between two sites, a borrow site and a fill site, you got hundreds of truck trips. LOS doesn't matter anymore. Are we talking about the VMT, how the detours and things like that would affect VMT, or I'm not really clear on how that situation would be evaluated as a traffic impact.
Sure. So the question is, if you're on a construction project and you have to take different routes because of the construction project, detours, things like that. Just driving around downtown Sacramento right now with the sewer line replacement project. You've got to move around quite a bit. I think the answer based on these guidelines is maybe, maybe not. Whether that would be a significant impact. Again, the rule of reason, can you argue, can you explain why it's not a significant impact? Remember, you're still evaluating air quality, greenhouse gases, noise, all the effects of transportation. VMT is just coming in as a new issue. I think you can argue if it's a short-term project, maybe it's not significant because it's short-term, whatever, but these guidelines don't really address that, and I think this will be out there. If they get adopted in the way they're written, there'll be a lot of questions, and frankly, it's a new hook for people who want to litigate projects. A new way to litigate, a new issue to litigate on. Any other questions? All right, well, we are scheduled for lunch. We went a little bit over. Lunch is here, so I think we can eat outdoors, although it looks like it's a little bit cloudy. And 45 minutes have been set aside for lunch, but if you guys want to just grab your lunch and eat it and start, by say 1 o'clock, that way we can get this right back on schedule and try to get you out of here for 4:30, 5 o'clock.